Thank you. Well, I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to talk about this subject. It's been fun researching it, and I hope you enjoy what I have to offer you today. I'm a little nervous because I have taught history, but that was to high school students. This is the first time somebody may actually listen. Come on in. This is a quote. I'd like for you to take a second and read it and see if you can fill in the blanks for me. Anybody got any ideas? Granting people the right to what? To vote. Okay. What? Anything else? Divorce. You haven't heard words like this in recent history? Gay marriage. Gay marriage. Okay, granting what? LGBTQ people the right to marry? Women? Look at you. Aren't you smart? This was actually in 1890. It was an anthropologist who said granting married women the right to vote would destroy the marriage. Well, we hear a lot about traditional marriage. I hope at the end of this presentation you'll realize that there's no such thing as traditional marriage. Marriage has been in evolution from the beginning, and it has mostly been affected by outside forces. Has anybody in this room been married more than 50 years? Well, amen. I can tell you that you went into your marriage with different expectations than Carol and Jim's daughter Catherine has going into her marriage in just a few weeks. I've got a lot to go over, so there will be no questions until after, and I think there'll be time at the end for a few questions. All right, let's get the legal part out of the way. Everything that you hear today is based on this book, Marriage, A History by Stephanie Coontz. She was most famous for a book called The Way We Never Were. My son actually used that in his sociology class, so I guess she's pretty well thought of. Okay, you ready to go? We've got 12,000 years of marriage to go through, so we're going to have to buckle up. Buckle up. Here we go. Let's start with prehistory. People had to survive. They did it through communities. People could not live by themselves or just with one or two people. Anthropologists think that most communities were 12 to 100. Average, maybe 24. They moved around a lot in these groups, and if they met another group, what they did was they exchanged men and women and put them in other groups, and that way they would make strangers into relatives. And so when they'd see them again, of course, then there'd be cousins and nieces and nephews and all that. This is prehistory. So there isn't a lot to tell you about prehistory. Let's get to history. Ancient societies. This is up to the fall of Rome in 476. Marriage during this time was all about wealth and power. As a matter of fact, archaeologists, when they have found communities, they've looked at the dwellings, and from the very beginning there was a difference in the type of dwellings that were in a community. So they believe that actually classes started from almost the beginning of societies. Sons and daughters were the way to move up in society. If you could sell your daughter or your son, maybe with a little bit of money, you could move up the ladder into a different class. This is when men codified their superiority. First thing that happened was the plow. Up until then, men and women both worked in the field, but a woman could not handle a plow. It took a lot of strength, and she couldn't bring her little children along with it. The other thing that happened, The other thing that happened was warfare. You, of course, don't send your little girls into war. You send your biggest and your strongest people to fight. At this time, a woman was already completely controlled by a man. She was controlled first by her father, then she was controlled by her husband, and if he were to die, son took over. This is when, pardon the joke, illegitimacy was born. It was very important that you knew where a child came from. There was no DNA testing back then, so you had to make sure that your progeny was actually yours. In upper classes, women were actually, after they were married, secluded, so there was no chance that she'd be running off and having a child from another person. Marriage, of course, was for procreation. What you wanted was children, so they would be your labor, and of course, that's how you using them to sell to marry someone else. Actually, during this time, males were so important that when a baby was born, the father would go up to the baby and pick it up, raise it, and that would mean, I accept this child. If they ignored the child was be left out in the elements to die. And of course, those were mostly little girls. Rules were adopted. This was the first time who you could marry was important. In Rome, you could not marry a foreigner unless you got permission from the authorities. You could not marry a prostitute. You could not marry a slave. Caesar Augustus actually instituted family values, which was kind of funny for him. He didn't have any. He knew that the way to grow his empire was to get more people. So he established kind of a child-raising program. He instituted a thing that said if you were not married by a certain age, you could not inherit anything. If you were married and didn't have any children, well, you could only get half of whatever inheritance was coming to you. And if you wanted to move up in a public position, the more children you had, the better chance it was for you to move up. And women who had lots of children, if they were widowed or even a freed slave, had more of an opportunity for freedom if they had at least 4 children. Marriage was a business merger. It was a means of new sources of wealth. It added workers to your endeavor through kids. And it was a way to preserve or pass on what you already had. There are stories all through the Old Testament about inheritance and how important it was. Think Jacob and Esau. It's all through. You had to establish, no questions. After, okay, sorry. Where was I? Okay, let's move a little further in to the fall of Rome, to the discovery of the New World. Here comes the church. For the first 8 centuries of Christianity, the church really didn't care about marriage except for the very highest level of people. Think royalty. But because of all of the inheritance stuff that had happened over the ancient times, incest became kind of an issue. In 721, Pope Gregory made these rules. Now listen to this because it has nothing to do with relations. You could not marry the godmother of your child. You could not marry the mother of your godchild. And there was no marriage of stepdaughters or stepmothers. Within a couple of decades, the church had made it so strict about marrying relatives that you could not marry someone who was descended from your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. In small villages, you know that had to be problematic. Until the 12th century, all it took to become married was consent of 2 individuals in intercourse. But there was a bishop in Paris who, I guess, thought too much and said, wait. If that's the case, then Jesus is illegitimate because Mary and Joseph consented, but there was no intercourse. So the church changed the idea that you didn't have to have intercourse, all you had to have was consent. And the problem with that was if a person could convince the church that you had consented to the marriage, you had to get married, whether you had or you hadn't. So you could be locked in a very bad marriage for a lifetime. By 1215, the church had established some rules about marriage. First, the bride had to have a dowry, which meant parents were still very involved in who you married. There had to be 3 sets of announcements. They called them banns. And then the wedding had to be in a church. Unfortunately, that didn't happen a whole lot, so the church just said, oh, well, okay, all marriages are valid. It was still a business concept, the 2 married couples. They were working together to do something, a trade, farm, but they were partners in that activity. 1/3 of all births during this time were out of wedlock. But unlike today, there was usually a marriage soon thereafter, either to the father or to someone else. The church got all of its ideas about divorce during this time. The clergy at this point could not marry, and the laity could marry, but they couldn't divorce. All you could do was get a separation, and with the separation, you could at least not be with the person, but you could not remarry. And there were 3 reasons that you could get a separation from your spouse. 1, adultery. 2, your spouse had committed heresy, or there was extreme cruelty, and I mean it had to be extreme. To get remarried, you could only do that with the church's granting an annulment. There were 3 reasons for that. 1, you had to prove you were too closely related to your spouse, and you shouldn't have gotten married. or if there had been previous consent for you to marry someone else, and you could prove that, or think about procreation. We have to make babies. Impotence. But it had to be proved. So, a group of wise women would go into a man's bedchamber and do everything, and I mean everything, they could to prove whether or not he was really impotent. Women were still not treated very well. A matter of fact, it was deteriorating. This was a famous saying during the time. A woman, a spaniel, a walnut tree. The more you beat them, the better they be. Moving on to 1559 to 1800, which is considered the early modern societies. At this point, young people started getting a little independence from their family. They no longer spent their lives with their parents on a farm or on a compound. They left home. But before they got married, they had to have enough money to establish a means of living. Either they had to buy a farm or obtain a trade or something that could provide for the family. So they needed money to get started. How did they earn that money? Well, a lot of men and women in Western Europe became servants. As a matter of fact, in the 16th and 17th century, 1/3 to 1/2 of all young people spent some time as servants. This caused people to get married later. The median age for a woman between 1500 and 1700 to get married was 26 years old. Because they never got enough money, 10 to 20% of women actually stayed single through their entire lives. There were advantages to these later marriages. First off, a woman didn't get married at the first chance she could have a child and then have one year after year after year after year and wear her body out by her 30s. Men and women were marrying at a similar age to each other, so this way a man who was much older didn't die and leave a young family to survive on their own. This is the time of the Protestant Reformation. And Protestants did not think that the clergy should be celibate. And pretty much for the same reason some of us think they shouldn't be celibate, because if they are, that's unnatural and they're going to do things maybe they shouldn't ought to do. Martin Luther he was modern. He said that he did not think parents had the right to force children into a marriage they didn't want to be in. But at the same time, he said parents absolutely could forbid a marriage that they didn't think should take place. Is love in it yet? Not quite. Love, as a matter of fact, was considered an impediment to a happy relationship. You can use your imagination on that one. The use of force against women was still acceptable. As a matter of fact, it was so acceptable that if a man did not punish his wife as much as he should, he was ridiculed by the community. Marriage vows came into being at this time. In the mid-16th century, these words were written, and we know them. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God, blah, blah, blah. And then in the end of it, it said, and this was to the man, with this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. That was a crock. Because the wife was legally required to worship her husband with her body. He could force sex upon her, beat her, imprison her in the home, and then while she was the one who endowed all her earthly goods to him. Moving on to the 1700s. Yes! Love finally comes into the picture. Think all those years. No love. Now there's love. This is when there was a whole lot of romantic novels. They were everywhere. This is Jane Austen's period, and she wrote a lot of books about why you shouldn't be in an arranged marriage and why you should marry for love. But there was some experts at the time said, if love is in the marriage, think of what could happen. First, there might be individualism. Oops. And women, well, they would probably not choose wisely if they had the opportunity. And if husbands and wives were intimates, could it be that a woman might want to be part of the decision-making? And if the church, state, and parents were not involved, what in the world would happen to society? This is the time when the idea of the monarchy was challenged. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Samuel Locke said that the divine right of kings was probably not right. God had not granted kings the right to be over their subjects. This was the time of our Revolutionary War. It was the time of the French Revolution. We were anti-monarchy. Well, guess what? The family's model had always been on the monarchy model. In other words, the man was the king, and the rest of the family was his subjects. So they thought, well, if the government is no longer based on that model, should marriages be based on that model? So what were they going to do? How would that evolve? Well, it became separate but equal. Men and women were no longer inferior or superior. They were equal, but they were very different. A man could go to work. He had those abilities. A woman, not so much. So two actual spheres evolved during this period. Before this, domesticity was actually thrift, hard work, and order, which was shared by both the husband and the wife. Now it became strictly the sphere of the wife. Before this, women had done things like, raise chickens, keep the small animals, grow food, cook. All that was considered an economic contribution to the family. No more. The man did all the economic contributions. The things that a woman did, she was doing it as an act of love. A woman was now judged on her emotional and moral contributions to the family and men were the providers for the family. A British conservative predicted at this time that we were headed for rights of women, then the rights of youth, then the rights of children, and then eventually the rights of babies. He knew what he was talking about, didn't he? Okay, to the 1800s. We had a new view of a woman's libido. Before this, remember, we had to contain women's passions because they could, heaven forbid, go and have relations with someone else. Now, with them being completely different from a man, maybe they were actually asexual. They really didn't want sex. Women were pure and probably didn't even want to respond to overtures from a man. Needless to say, out-of-wedlock births declined during this period. Frigidity was actually a virtue. Women could refuse sex to a man, and the man would probably respect it. But the idea of a woman's purity created a problem for a man. Think the distinction between good sex and a good woman. They don't mix. Wives, of course, were the moral leaders of the church. Of the family. They actually got the men to go to church, by the way. That was one of their jobs. Wives were more important than children. The birth rate in 1900 was 4 per couple. In 1800, it was 7 per couple. This is the first time that judges started awarding custody of children to a woman. Sorry. Home replaces the house. Before this, the house was the extended family. Think of the house of David. This was where you came from. And at this point, a house becomes nothing more than a structure. Home was so important that the celebrations that went on within a family were no longer big social events in the community, like Christmas, birthdays, christenings, anniversaries. They were done in intimate places in the home with small groups. The one thing, though, that went in the opposite direction and became more public and more out in the community was weddings. In the 1800s, in the 18th century, back in the 1700s, a man reached his epitome of respect from his peers by his working for the common good. Think of our founding fathers. But by this time, by the 1800s, a man got his highest level of respect for the way he handled his family. We lived in different spheres at this time. Men went off to work. They had their thing. Women were at the home, and they did not mix. A man didn't understand what a woman did, and a woman didn't understand what a man did. So your best friends were probably of your own sex, because they were the ones who understood you. And this created a problem in the family. Women became lonely because they couldn't talk to their husbands, the person they loved, about the house. And men were beginning to resent the pressure of supporting a family. World War I and the Depression. The pendulum swings. women were no longer frigid. The birth control was finally publicized, how you could do it. Women were granted the right to vote in 1920. This was the era of the flappers, which was just youth revolting. People had been able to select their own partners now for almost 100 years, but now they really wanted to sample the merchandise first. In 1920, at least a third, probably a half of women had had sex before marriage. Men no longer stopped trying to have sex with women. They did everything they could, and now it was the responsibility of the woman to stop it. Women had passions now. They weren't frigid, but it was up to them to control anything that would happen. The automobile gave couples the freedom to go off on their own. This is when the word date came into being. 92% of college women in 1920 admitted to petting. Drinking was fashionable, and cocaine was everywhere. No, Bryant, I'm not going to Coca-Cola. There was an over-the-counter cough remedy that had more cocaine in it than the cocaine on the streets in 1980. Divorce increases. At the end of the 1920s, there was 1 in 6 chance of divorce. In 1928, 1/4 of all married men and women admitting to have an affair. But marriage was not rejected. People still wanted to do it, and women still thought they should please their husbands. The family emerges. For the first time in history, American children lived in families in which the father was the primary wage earner. The wife was not a full-time worker outside of the home, and the children were in school instead of working themselves. Marriage and family was the most important emotional aspect of life. Then came World War II, and you know what happened. Men went to war and women went into the workforce. Female labor increased by 60%. Women, when they went to take these jobs, thought it was temporary. It was only going to be short-lived, but the longer they were in the jobs, the more they enjoyed doing it. Experts, though, were very concerned that a woman would get used to being in charge of the house and the checkbook.